In the late 1990s, Holly and I taught English classes during the summer terms at a small university outside of St. Petersburg, Russia. One of those years, a professor joined our classes to brush up on conversational English skills, and over those weeks, made even longer by those famous and beautiful white nights, we had the delight of getting to know Vladimir a little more. We traded stories together. He shared books with us by his wife, who translated English poetry into Russian and vice versa. We went mushroom hunting with his family in the grand forests north of the city, where I learned that there are mosquitoes that can bite through denim. But the most memorable time we spent with Vladimir was during a brief trip in March 2000, when he took us on a guided tour of St. Petersburg and shared stories of his youth during the siege of course, what was then Leningrad during World War II. I had studied the siege before, but viewing it through the eyes of a man who had lived through it changed everything. The city looked and felt completely different. Somehow, we hadn't really noticed before the scars from bombs that still etched their memories into the sides of buildings. And we didn't know what it had really meant for musicians who were literally starving to death to take the stage there in December of 1942 to perform Shostakovich's Symphony No. 7. The music broadcast across the city and even onto toward the German lines on loudspeakers as an act of defiance and resistance. Before that tour, we couldn't even begin to understand the human loss, the human side of that loss behind the incalculable numbers that we had read. 872 days, more than 100,000 bombs dropped on the city, approximately 1.5 million deaths, over 600,000 from starvation, 1.4 million people eventually evacuated. Vladimir spoke about how people boiled leather-bound books and wallpaper glue to make a broth to fill their empty bellies. And to hear his gentle, soft voice telling these stories, we wondered at the power of the human body and the human spirit to hold such grief and devastation and turn it into poetry and music and hope. During the tour, we stopped at a row of just ordinary, boring-looking apartment buildings, and Vladimir paused, the silence settling in on us as he gathered himself. This, he told us, is where he lived when a bomb fell through floors of the building. Amazingly, no one was killed because the bomb had been sabotaged by factory workers. It was a simple act of resistance, probably at great risk to those workers, and it saved our friend's life. We lingered there in gratitude and reverence for those who were brave enough, clever enough to do whatever they could to save a life, even in the middle of a war, even at risk to themselves. We lingered in the hope that the world could be different and that humans, all of us, we could be part of the difference. It's impossible to know how often this happened, but we do know that forced labor became increasingly common in the later years of the war, and these workers had no motivation to help the Germans in the war effort. Combined with shortages of materials and poor working conditions, many bombs were defective. Add to that these intentional sabotages, and a lot of the bombs were completely ineffective. Richard J. Evans, writing in the New York Review, shared a similar story to that of our Russian friend. Quote, "A German bomb fell through the roof of my wife's grandmother's house in the East End of London in 1943 and lodged unexploded in a bedroom wardrobe. When the bomb disposal unit opened it up, they found a note inside. 'Don't worry, English,' it said. 'We're with you.' Polish workers." The world is, of course, different today, with Russia as the aggressor in a horrifying war against Ukraine. Now it is Russian bombs falling through Ukrainian apartments and Ukrainians fleeing before the violence. As I noted during the first days of the invasion of Ukraine, the last 8 years of violence in the East created 1.5 million displaced people. They are part of the more than 84 million forcibly displaced people worldwide, 26.6 million of whom are refugees who have fled their home nations. They come from around the world, but more than 2/3 are from places that have filled the headlines over the last years: Syria, Afghanistan, South Sudan, Myanmar, and Venezuela. These statistics are a key indicator of just how violent and broken our human relationships have become, and the number of forcibly displaced people has doubled since 2010, reaching an all-time high. With the invasion of Ukraine, we can now add 4.3 more million people who have fled their countries to those totals. As Ella Fassler has noted, this is the largest movement of people in Europe since World War II. And despite heroic resistance of thousands of Russian protesters, the numbers released in March showed that 58% of Russians support this invasion, with only 23% opposing it. 75% of older respondents, old enough to remember those horrors of World War II, amazingly support this new war. In a report by Robert Colson for Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, a 28-year-old woman, Russian woman living near the Ukrainian border, protested the war and lamented her parents' support of it. At first, her mother's main argument was, "There's nothing we can do. Nothing depends on us," said Yekaterina, who asked to be identified only by her first name. Later, her argument was even worse. "They asked us for help." The war didn't shake her. It hasn't evoked any emotions in her. I was just shocked by her reaction. Now I'm asking myself, who is this woman? She continued, noting that her mother shed tears over Soviet sacrifices during World War II every year on May 9th, which is marked in Russia as Victory Day. Do I even know her? How can a living person become so hard-hearted about a war started by their own government? For the first time in my life, I felt real shame and revulsion toward my parents, she said. Since then, I've hardly spoken to them. I've been carrying these diverging stories around with me, both stories born out of the horror and grief of war. And stories like our friend Vladimir's, an act of resistance and kindness, crossed borders and created community in the most astounding and unlooked for of places and ways, like a note tucked inside a sabotaged bomb. Don't worry, we're with you. In stories like Yekaterina's, we see the shadow. Saying no to the war had meant saying no to her loved ones. For the first time in my life, I felt real shame and revulsion for my parents. These are choices that we are constantly making. How do we connect with people across differences? When is that connection even possible? And when is it time to set a hard line? How do we find and build community when we're isolated and rejected, or when we are simply exhausted and ready to give up, when we need community the most? We feel all this deeply, circling around the question of what it means to be human. Queries like this connect us with a haunting, aching pain that echoes across cultures and ages and stories and songs from around the world, asking, how can we bear to go on? And more especially, how can we bear to go on in a world that has found a way to make things that we thought wouldn't, that we thought couldn't get worse? Just last year, one Easter ago, we gathered together, and at that time we were grappling with the realities of the pandemic. We were protesting white supremacy and police violence while watching the opening days of Derek Chauvin's trial. We were mourning a string of mass shootings and witnessing the coup in Myanmar and civil war in Ethiopia, to name just a few. This year, we're still grappling with the realities of the pandemic. We're still grappling with the realities of white supremacy and police violence because if we look at the numbers, police violence statistics are basically unchanged. And while our attention is turned to Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the terrifying report of war crimes there, the Sunset Parkway attack is also, Sunset Park subway attack is also on our news. And we have another week filled with mass shootings, leaving at least 8 dead. And we have deadly flooding in the Philippines, likely a result from climate change, to name just a few. We could go through the timeline and repeat this exercise year after year, these snapshots of human suffering that take us back to that haunting pain. How do we live in a world with so much suffering, where terrible things are added to terrible things week in and week out? And how do we keep the possibility of change alive? A change towards life, beauty, truth, and love. Today is Easter. And in the Easter stories and stories like them from around the world, what is most meaningful and applicable to me is not the miracles, not the sentiment nor the supernatural, but the resurrection of hope. In the lectionary readings for today, Mary Magdalene runs to the tomb while it's still dark, at the first moment her Sabbath duties would allow. Seeing the missing stone, she assumes the worst, and her already broken heart is broken even more. How could anything get any worse? Wasn't crucifying Jesus enough? So she runs to Peter and the disciples, distraught, and says, they've taken him, and we don't even know where the body is. Everything is lost. There is no hope. They go back to the tomb, and Mary is left with nothing but her tears, weeping outside the tomb. Even when she sees the angel, and I love this bit, she sees the angels there, it doesn't change anything for her. Her grief is so great that she just repeats the lament to them. They've taken away my Lord, and I don't know where they've laid him. And then, standing next to the resurrected Jesus in the story, she just thinks he's the gardener. So great is her grief. And she asked him, where's the body? Tell me where it is, and I'll take care of it. It's only when Jesus speaks her name that it brings her back to life, brings her back to the possibility of hope, and gives her a new message. It reconnects her with herself, with her humanity, and it reconnects her with her community. The power of connection, of speaking each other's names in the midst of grief, calling back ourselves to one another, to the possibility of life and love, that's a beautifully human power. Our care and love for each other, calling each other back from the edge of despair, calling each other back into community. We remember these stories, or at least I remember these stories, from Mary weeping at Jesus' tomb to my friend Vladimir standing outside his childhood apartment flats, because we know this is how we keep pressing forward while it is still dark, while our hearts are still broken, and while our hope is nearly gone. We know that the work we do for change, it might not ever accomplish anything. It might not accomplish what we want. But we also know that doing something, even when it feels like nothing will come of it, that's the only way we keep the possibility of change alive. This week, I watched a video of Ukrainian firefighters rescuing a puppy that had been buried in rubble. Somehow that little dog was still alive, and I was holding back tears. The video hadn't been verified, but even if it turns out to just be a story, it's the kind of story that humans seem to need to tell. We need to remember the potential for goodness in ourselves and in the world. We need to see that we can bring life out of the rubble. And although not as easy to put into a cheery video, it still brought tears to my eyes to see people coming together in amazing ways to ease what suffering they could for Ukrainian refugees. In the early days of the invasion, many of those fleeing the violence didn't consider themselves as refugees. They were temporarily leaving the city to get away from the bombs, and then they were going to go back home. But as the invasion has dragged on, both refugees and aid organizations began making plans for how to support them for the long haul. This was one of the main points of the article I quoted earlier. Already, Fassler reported, an informal, loosely connected grassroots aid network of about a dozen groups is working on establishing supply chains and long-term warehouse aid hubs in Moldova, Romania, Slovakia, and hope to set up hubs at halfway points in places like the Netherlands and Germany. Other groups are organizing specifically to meet the needs of minorities that have faced discrimination and have been overlooked during the refugee process, including Roma, Indians, and Africans, as well as LGBTQIA+ folks. Human beings are paradoxes in this way. We have the potential, the capacity to commit and keep committing unimaginable violence that destroys people's lives and homes and creates refugees, but we also have the potential, the capacity to respond to suffering with generosity and with justice, creating friendships that heal. Taylor Fairbank, the operations director at Distribute Aid, points out the link between these two. He said, people are fleeing climate change driven by for-profit companies or wars driven by interests of imperialist governments. The West is especially complicit in outsourcing the violence that is driving its economic growth onto poor Black and brown countries, and then punishing those who dare flee to safety. So not only do we have to create a welcoming atmosphere to those who make it to our borders, but we have to support grassroots movements in our own countries and around the world that are fighting back against politicians and companies who capitalize off these harmful conditions. And this is the best meaning that I can hear in the Easter story this year. We bear the terrifying potential for violence and harm of one another and the earth. And we also bear the incredible potential for generosity and kindness, even in the most traumatic and difficult of circumstances. And the Easter story holds this paradox. It begins with oppression and violence, with the state-sponsored murder of a human being whose crime was a fiery call to justice and whose ethic was love and compassion. It acknowledges the terror we feel in the wake of violent injustice, and then it speaks to us of hope. But it's not a hope that sits back and waits. It is a hope that comes to us even in our weariness and says, please don't give up. For that to work, to be sustainable, we need each other. We need community, to speak each other's names and remind us of our humanity, and to give each other breaks and to rest and regroup. Of course, what we really want is a world where life isn't so hard, where we get to enjoy poetry and music, gardening and good meals, without that joy being diminished by the heartbreak of discrimination, bigotry, violence, poverty, oppression, ecological destruction, and the like. That is the world we're fighting for. But until it exists, we have to do whatever we can, both to change our communities and to encourage one another to not give up. As I learned again from Vladimir from that day over 2 decades ago, outside the flats where he had survived a bomb, we live in the hope that the world can be different and that we can be part of the difference. Happy Easter.
Amen. Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.